So I just want to do an intro while she's setting up. Dr. Rupal Patel, she's a professor at Northeastern, and she is the vice president of voice and accessibility at Veritone, following her founding and CEO-ship of Vocal ID, voice AI company. She's going to be talking about beyond end-to-end speech synthesis. What have we created and how do we protect its misuse?
Good morning. My name is Rupal Patel, and as John said, I'm faculty at Northeastern University, both in computer science as well as in the Bouvet College of Health Sciences. I founded a company called Vocal ID, which was recently acquired by Veritone, which is a publicly traded company on the NASDAQ, just happened this summer. So I do have to say that whatever I say here are my thoughts and have nothing to do with Veritone specifically. And a lot of the work I'm going to be talking today has to do with the work that we were doing at Vocal ID to create customized and personalized voices. And some of the research that I've been doing at Northeastern in the past as well. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is that we've learned a lot about synthesis in the last decade has really advanced considerably, but there are new challenges as a result of these advances, and that's what I want to focus on today. But I want to do that through use cases. I also want to take a little bit of a step backward in terms of sort of where we've come from to show what real change has happened in the last few decades in this area of speech synthesis. So I'm going to focus on speech synthesis, and I'm going to specifically focus on text-to-speech synthesis, as opposed to voice conversion, which today also gets lumped together with speech synthesis and speech generation. So the outline of my talk is, really talking about the early days, our old sort of quest for machines that can emulate human speech goes back centuries. It's not really that we've started having this infatuation with having Alexa or Google Home talk, right? For years and centuries, we've been thinking about how humans talk and how to emulate or build machines that can emulate that skill as well, since it is such a unique skill to the things that we sort of cherish. The next phase of my talk is around the perfect storm. So there's a lot of new technologies that have really come together, and not just technologies, but sort of the way that we are interacting with one another and with machines today that created this perfect storm for a rebirth or a renaissance of research in speech synthesis. And so that's sort of what I go into next. And then I'm going to go into these use cases. These use cases are beyond what we would be able to think about maybe about 10, 20 years ago. And they're both exciting. They pose opportunities as well as challenges. And what are some of those challenges? Really, I want to spark this conversation because I don't have the answers to how we deal with those challenges. I think that my purpose today is to really bring attention to the fact that there are challenges when we have advances in technology so rapidly. And that actually creates opportunities for scientists, opportunities for researchers that are in this room to think about what do we do next, not just from a technological point of view sometimes, but also from a policy point of view, from a business point of view, from a societal point of view in terms of ethics as well. All right, so that's kind of where we're going to end. And I'm hoping that we have actually some time for questions toward the end. It's remarkable that I'm able to get this down to about 35 minutes because usually my talk, 35 slides, sorry, because usually I have a gazillion slides, but I'm going to try to keep it to around 35 to 40 minutes so that we can have time for conversation. Okay, starting off with a brief history. So back in the early 1700s, there were mechanical models of speech production. This is showing the euphonia model, which Google has now adopted for euphonia being something different, but the initial the mechanical models were things like this, kind of scary looking in terms of, putting that little head of that porcelain mask there, but essentially emulating the different structures and the different subsystems involved in speech production, all the way from respiration to phonation to articulation. And then you had actually a show where the Faber's euphonia model actually went on the road to basically show people what speech is all about. And it was this fascination with how do we produce speech and how can we recreate it? Then in the 1940s, there was the Bell Labs voter, which I'm going to show you a little video of, just to kind of jog your memory about what it sounded like back then and what we are now used to. Because when we're used to incredible sounding speech synthesis today, we forget how far we've come. There's also a number of mechanical models of speech production, many of them which are actually being worked on still. And a lot of that is not because of the speech that they can produce, the clarity or the naturalness of the speech, but to better understand speech production in humans and also to better understand speech production in the pathological system. So my background is actually in speech disability. So I work with used to work as a speech language pathologist with people with very severe speech disorders. And from that work, I think there's a lot of new insights in terms of how the average typical individual or learner learns how to speak, but what happens when a child cannot speak that clearly because of neurological impairment or muscular impairment. And then what happens to those of us who lose our ability to speak gradually because of acquired illnesses. And so many times these mechanical models, things like Brad Story's model where he uses the MRIs to actually understand how speech is produced. The idea is not to produce clear speech because you're not going to necessarily get that just from models that are derived from an MRI system, from structural models, but it does help us understand what happens when something goes wrong. And then in the 70s and 80s, we really have the heyday of the concatenative synthesis, right? And then unit selection, parametric synthesis, and neural synthesis in the last 10 years, maybe 15 years or so. So let's start with the voter, just to kind of get our ears acclimated to what it used to sound like. You hear that?
The two energy sources, they give a total of 20 separate components to be used in building up speech sounds.
I think the sound is not shared through the HDMI. So it's not playing through the speakers. You guys couldn't hear this. No. So I think maybe in the settings you need to set your output to the HDMI in the audio settings. Okay. Let's try this. There you go. Okay.
Okay.
Wait.
Oh, big, I think I
used to share. Okay, actually, when we hear, maybe I'm gonna. Oops, actually, it's here, so that we see. Perfect.
Okay, perfect.
Wonderful.
Let's see. Now we lost it.
Wait, you could hear it. Okay, let's try again. Let's try. Maybe restart sharing because maybe disrupted this sound sharing. How about now? Do you just?
Yeah.
There are 10 filter circuits in the motor, and combined with the two energy sources, they give a total of 20.
That's crazy. Oh, now it's Zoom audio device. Verge, why?
The Zoom will pick up the speaker noise, I think, right?
Right. We can also in worst case scenario. Still no? Okay, I think we're gonna have to do this
Old school.
old school. Yeah. Interesting.
I think it doesn't like to compete with that.
Okay. We're gonna have to I don't know how to do this, but
I think this one was done.
this one goes to the
Oh, I
recording
see.
only. For the audience.
Yeah, I
guess you
will.
need to- all right.
I'll do this.
Sorry, guys.
Well, here we go.
Always happens with audio.
There are 10 filter circuits in the motor, and combined with the two energy sources, they give a total of 20 separate components to be used in building up speech sounds. But now let's have Mr. Garrett and Miss Harper actually show us what the voter can do with these 20 separate sounds.
Well, we've heard the voter make a word, and by combining words, of course, you get a sentence. For example, Helen, will you have the voter say, "She saw me"? That sounded awfully flat. How about a little expression? Say the sentence in answer to these questions. Who saw you? Whom did she see? Well, did she see you or hear you? Now, so far, you have only heard the vote.
Okay, you get enough of that, right? You get an idea of sort of the, I won't call it primitive, but the basic sound of speech there, right? But you also see some modulation there, which I think is pretty amazing for back in the 40s in terms of the prosodic modulation there as well. Concatenative synthesis, though, is really what we are used to, and what has become really where speech synthesis was accepted for a long time before we had these new advances. And in concatenative synthesis, essentially what you have is you have a ton of recordings, and then you're cutting those up into bits of speech and regluing them together. Many of you probably know what all that's all about, and so I'm just going to move on to the next. So the perfect storm. The perfect storm is this combination of voice-first hardware being available. And of course, by that I mean both the cell phone, so Apple's release of the iPhone, as well as then in the early, I guess, 2014, 2015 area, the Echo, and then Google Home, right? So now you've got a number of devices that can play audio, and many applications are now going to be built on those voice-first hardware devices to create synthetic speech. In addition, you've got advanced machine learning techniques being evolved during this period of time, as well as the open source movement. I think prior to that, we had some labs, that the CMU lab, for example, and we had some groups in Japan that were doing speech synthesis. And of course, DARPA had put a lot of money into speech synthesis for a while. And as soon as we got to a certain level in terms of clarity and acceptability and naturalness of voice, for example, that was the state of the art. There wasn't a lot of change. So basically 70s, 80s, there's not a ton of change in speech synthesis technology. Of course, many of you in this room probably were working on that work, or at least are involved in it or read about it. But what I'm saying is the change wasn't as rapid as it is today. Okay. So I actually wanted to show a couple of graphs of what I mean by this. So if you look at various different technologies, different platforms or hardware platforms, on which we now then develop different software, right? So the adoption, for example, of the laptop or the computer took 20 years or so. The adoption of the internet also took quite a while, around 20 years ish. The radio, same. The TV was a lot faster, right? Many of us were sort of craving that. And so you've got this faster application, faster kind of adoption within, this is just the US, but you can see this kind of more generally as well around the world. The smartphone was one of the first things we'd seen where people were saying, oh my goodness, this technology is being adopted so quickly. And now we're saying basically market penetration across the world. The smart speakers, though, were ones that shocked everyone, where people didn't believe that there could be anything faster than the iPhone adoption, right? And here it was. And almost all of us had an Echo or a Google Home or a headless speaker in the home. And so what does that create? That means, though, just like the iPhone, once everyone had the hardware device, now it was time to have developers create software and use their imagination of what they wanted to use this hardware for. It's not just for calling people, not just for listening to music, not just for figuring out the weather, but all sorts of other applications. And that is because you have a number of different developers using their creativity to figure out what can they do with this piece of hardware. That's sort of similar. That was the promise or the similarity, or we thought was what's going to happen with smart speakers. But in terms of smart speakers, part of the thing is it hasn't been as quick, primarily because some of these have been closed systems. Although we're now seeing that Bixby is becoming an open system, and so hopefully we'll see more generation of different kinds of software there. But as relates to speech synthesis, this push of smart speakers is really what pushed speech synthesis. And I don't know, Tara, if when you talk today about speech recognition, whether you'll also see some more advances in speech recognition as a result of the smart speaker evolution as well. Anyway, that's one thing. I think that's one of the forces in terms of these advances. The first, I think, for the smart speakers was some change in adoption or acceleration of speech recognition. And this graph from Capgemini basically talks about how speech synthesis, speech recognition has improved radically as a result of the smart speaker adoption as well. So the first kind of wave of speech synthesis change as a result of these smart speakers was parametric synthesis. So back in the early 2000s, there was quite a bit of work done on HMM-based synthesis. And HMM-based synthesis did provide a little bit more improvement over concatenative synthesis in the sense that you needed less data, not necessarily in the quality of the speech, but you needed less data to create those synthetic voices and a little bit less time to create those voices as well. Neural synthesis is really where we are today, right? This is where we are today. And we've had a variety of versions from Talkatron, the first version of Talkatron to WaveNet, which wasn't really something that you could use in real time, but it also offered us the capability of saying, well, what's the gold standard? Where can we go? What's possible here? And then Talkatron 2, which kind of is what I'm showing here, which is a combination of those. And still, though, you can't really run this in real time, and you'd have to have Google powered, infrastructure to run this. So how do you do this for how do you create synthetic voice for applications that are going to be running on someone's phone? How do you create applications that need to be real time? There is a lot of advances at InterSpeech. I think there was a whole track on speech synthesis this year, which was pretty lively. And I would say that there's a lot of variations on Talkatron and other versions, the char-to-char model. There's a number of different variations, and although end-to-end synthesis is a lot of what we're talking about, many companies and many researchers are really using a combination of end-to-end and, well, not necessarily fully end-to-end, because there's modularization of prosody, modularization of the phonetic unit, and so on, phonetic dictionary, and so on. Okay, so the next piece I want to go into is what do all these advances mean, and why is it important? So the first sort of clump of change that we saw between concatenative synthesis to deep neural networks and recurrent neural network-based synthesis, which is basically the HMM methods, gave us some advances in assistive technology and in telephony. So many of us use speech synthesis or listen to speech synthesis when we call automated agents, right? And in these automated agents, there's a lot of current synthesis, but there's also some concatenative models and older models that are still being used in these applications. As we advance to more the WaveNet variations and the Talkatron variants that I'm talking about in 2019, 2020, we can start seeing changes. We can start seeing applications like gaming and e-learning and things like that, where the voice quality needs to improve so that it's on par with human voices. And then more recently now, we have the capability of changing things like the prosody of the voice, the intonation of the voice, in these newer variants, these multi-speaker models, as well as these multilingual models. And there's applications in entertainment. So I'm going to unpack some of these, starting off with the assistive technology application. So use case one is what I'm calling vocal ID. So vocal ID stood for vocal identity. And for many people until basically 2013, 2014, who used a synthesized voice as their primary method of communication, they had to rely on a handful of voices. So these are individuals who were born with a condition like cerebral palsy, or later on acquired ALS, had neck cancer, different conditions where they could not speak naturally and had to use a device to talk. So for them, back in early 2000s, 2010 and so on, really there weren't so many voice choices, and so they had to rely on a handful of these voices. And what we tried to do with this research that started at Northeastern in my lab was to figure out a way that we could create more personalized voices. Because voice, our belief is that voice is identity. And the idea is that you and I, every single person in this room has a unique voice that identifies who they are and what they do, and maybe even how they use their voice in terms of the raspiness of their voice and so on and so forth, right? And so when someone has to use a device to talk, if that talking box speaks the same as their ATM or the same as, some other random machine that talks, there is really no identity. And that actually affects their self-esteem. It affects whether or not they adopt this technology, whether or not they integrate in society, and so on and so forth. But it's really hard to create a customized, personalized synthetic voice for each individual, especially one when they have very limited speech motor control anyway. And so we had to come up with a new method of creating a synthetic voice for them that actually fit them, right? So that's what we were trying to do. So the first thing we did is actually went back to basic speech science theory. So the theory of speech production called the source filter theory of speech production is one that you probably heard of a long time ago in speech science class, and one that is not a perfect theory, right? So it's a theory. So it's really not completely true, but we think about speech as being a combination of the source, which is the air source, as well as the vibrations of the vocal folds, which are then pushed through the rest of the vocal tract, the chambers of your head and neck, to produce consonants and vowels, and the intonation is also coming from the source characteristics. So typically, when I'm speaking into this microphone, we are recording both source and filter and all the other room dynamics and whatever. So it's happening within us, but hopefully we can decompose these two when we're trying to think about the digital world, right? So here, the theory is that while you and I can't dissociate our source and our filter from one another while we are speaking, if we're digitally recombining this for speech synthesis, we can. So we can take only the source from one speaker and only the filter, and as much as you can, from another speaker who can actually talk. So I am not saying here that only speaker identity characteristics are in the source. Speaker identity characteristics are both in the source and in the filter. But in this case, individuals who are non-speaking cannot control their filter. That is why they have a speech disability. They are unable to move their lips, their tongue, and the rest of their articulators in ways that you and I can to make speech. And so we have to rely on their speaker identity cues that are within the source characteristics of their voice, okay? So just making sure that you understand that I'm not saying source is where all the identity is, but in these speakers, really that's the only part of their identity that we want, because the rest of their identity that has to do with their filter is corrupted, and we do not want that. But if we can find someone similar in age, gender, size, all of these things, we can borrow the filter characteristics from their age-matched donor. So that was the theory behind what we were doing. Basically, find a target speaker, find a source speaker that is similar to them, a surrogate speaker that is similar to them, and then recombine these digitally to create a synthetic voice that sounds like it could have belonged to this individual. You all follow me? Okay. So I had the chance to talk about this work at TED Women in 2013. And I proposed at the end of my talk, what if you could donate your voice to someone in need? And we actually honestly thought that a few hundred people would sign up for this. We thought, how many people are going to sit in the lab for, at that point, 7 to 10 hours and record all the speech to share it with someone in need? We didn't have any idea what would happen. What happened, in fact, though, is lots of people signed up. Thousands of people signed up. So the first thing we did is we created a user interface where people could record their voice rather than having to go into the lab. Now, this poses a lot of challenges because, you and I know how to use a microphone, although today it's been a challenge. But many average individuals who were wanting to be volunteers, we had thousands of people wanting to volunteer around the world. And it was challenging to figure out how we're going to get good quality data for speech synthesis. As we all know in this room, speech synthesis data needs to be clean. But that was part of the work that we did, is try to figure out a simple, clean user interface to gather this data and then to also clean that data so that we could use it for speech synthesis. And it was quite a challenge. And that's what we did at Vocal ID. So UI looked something like this. Actually, the first version did not look like this. This is the second version where essentially it's a teleprompter, right? Nothing too amazing here, but what is the work that was done was all in the filtering of the data and also all the system process to capture all this data from the average individual. So we have people all the way from 6 to 91 years of age contributing their voice, people of all accents and so on. So they are told to read line by line here. They could listen to a sample, so you didn't have to be literate. And there's just the 4 arrow keys on the bottom are basically graphed onto these keys down here, so that you can you don't have to hear the mouse clicks. The first few thousand people that we just got all these mouse clicks, and we got people really not using the UI very easily. And so we had to kind of figure out a way to get those mouse clicks out, not just post-processing, but also just making sure that we had less of that from the beginning. So today, there are about 95,000 contributors to the Human Voice Bank Initiative, about 18 million sentences collected from people around the world at 120 countries. Like I said, they range in age from 6 to 91. Many are using this interface as a tool in schools where the kids are learning how to read aloud, and they're also learning about speech disabilities while they're doing this. So it's sort of a service learning aspect as well. There's companies that are working with us in order to have employee engagement opportunities for their employees so that they can volunteer and be a voice for someone in need. So there's really an interesting sort of a movement that's happening with this, which is quite exciting. So what do you do with all these recordings, right? So going back, here's a young girl, her name's Maeve. Maeve was one of our first users of this technology. And this is the kind of sound that Maeve can produce. Back again. It's really just a vocalization. Now, when I was a speech pathologist, one of the things I noticed is that even when people have a device to communicate, they typically still want to use their vocalizations. It's just natural to make sound. And with familiar individuals, people understand what they want. And sometimes it's context, and sometimes it's just people understand, what they're saying because the intonation patterns. Also, as you get used to someone with a very strong accent, think about it as, you learn how to decode that, right? So even with someone with a very severe speech disorder, it's obviously not an accent. It's far more severe than that, but there are aspects of their voice that are preserved still. And if you're working with kids with many of these kinds of devices, you'll hear that they don't use their devices as often because they'll use their vocalizations when they can with familiar communication partners. And what we learned in the early empirical research that we were doing is that much of that information is in the prosody of their voice, the modulations of the source characteristics of their voice. But you wonder, well, what is identity, bearing in those cues, right? So we have to actually inverse filter this audio to get that identity bearing information and then recombine it with the source characteristics of the individual that's a speech donor. So once we have those samples, then we can go into this multi-space model and find a voice match for this individual. Initially, especially when we were working with Maeve, we had not that many voice donors. And in fact, her sisters were her voice donors. But as we got more speakers, and now we don't really do that work. We don't try to match people with siblings just because we don't want to cause any sibling rivalries or anything like that. And we also really want to make sure that they get the right voice for what they prefer. So once we have the recipient's voice sample, then we're sort of looking on this multidimensional space for the voice match. And then in this case, as I said, it was their sisters. And so then you can essentially get a data set of good, clean speech. We're looking at about 90 minutes of speech from the speech donor these days. It was a lot more in the past. So this is a schematic of really what we're doing. I'm not going to unpack it all, but essentially you get that vocalization, plus you have
ice cream is my guilty pleasure.
An entire set of, a corpus from the speech donor. So imagine this is around, 2,000 sentences. You're going to inverse filter the target speaker, and you're also going to do the same with, you're basically going to source filter separate the donor speech. And then what you're going to do is morph all of the samples of the donor speech with the target speech intonation. Okay. And then you're going to feed that into the neural network. Okay. So I'm just going to pretend this neural network is this model.
I can't wait for my friends to hear my new voice. My parents are really happy I'm not addicted to Fortnite. I want to meet Taylor Swift.
So these are some of the few things that Maeve said with her voice. You'll notice that this isn't the most advanced synthesis, and partly it's because the devices that these individuals use are several generations back. They're not allowed to be online, so they can't use anything that is on the cloud and so on and so forth. So one of the things that we noticed as we were building these bespoke voices, now there's a few hundred people that have, Vocal ID bespoke voices, or now Veritone bespoke voices that they're using in everyday communication. Some of the impacts are things like that the fact that they're communicating more, the fact that they're using their voice in unfamiliar situations. So typically they would use it at school, but they wouldn't use it, when they went to the grocery store, but now they are, and so on and so forth. So there's greater social participation. We've also seen that people who have lost their ability to speak are also recording their voice on the platform. And so we're working with individuals like that. So I'm just going to show you this next sample. This is a gentleman who lost his voice due to throat cancer. And so he recorded prior to his laryngectomy and his glossectomy. So he lost both his voice box as well as part of his tongue because of the cancer and the way it had spread. He had 2 weeks to record, and in those 2 weeks to record his speech, he was able to record about 2,000 sentences over a course of several days. The recording sounded like this.
The only thing I liked in school is arithmetic.
And there's 2,000 of these. They go into the system again, and they produce something like this.
My family threw a surprise birthday party for me. There was close to 100 friends and family. Most had not seen me since my surgery, but thanks to your technology, they heard me instantly recognizing my voice.
Okay, so I'm going to move on. So essentially, I wanted to show this graph to say really what happened even just at Vocal ID in terms of from 2014 to 2018 in the assistive technology realm, how the synthesis became on par, like in terms of understandability. When you look at the MOS scores or the naturalness scores, you're starting to approach human speech. Naturalness was always lower than understandability, but understandability these days is really, or intelligibility is really not a great measure, because we understand most of what the speech synthesis is saying. It's the naturalness that is off. I'm actually going to skip the audio samples here just for sake of time, because I want to move on. Okay. So the use case 2 is content generation. So as the synthesis got better and better, there is the capability now of using the same technology for broader use cases. And that's really where we embarked in 2019. And I think the most applicable use cases are short form audio. And the reason short form audio makes sense for speech synthesis, for example, in-store marketing and for IVR, for radio and streaming applications and so on, is because it's short and the intonation part you can modify, but it's not the same intonation all the time. And I think intonation and prosody are the main things that we still need to work on with synthesis. Long form we're starting to see some use cases where people are using it for e-learning, audiobooks, as well as for podcasts. But I think, again, there's still a lot of tweaking that has to happen to get that. So it's okay offline, but not necessarily okay just coming right out of the speech synthesizer itself. So here are some samples.
Thank you for calling the Community Health Center. To learn about our memberships, press 1. To book a trainer, press 2.
General IVR. Let's move on.
Combining its fun and responsive city driving capabilities with hybrid power, the new Toyota Yaris Hybrid truly is full of positive energy. When you have the energy to keep going, why stop?
If you heard that on the radio, would you know it's synthetic? Maybe. There's another one.
They aren't just barrels. It isn't just highway work. It's a community investment. In a world that can be in such a rush, here's a place to keep it slow and steady. Every driver makes a difference, so stay alert. Eliminate distractions and mind your speed. Good choices behind the wheel keeps us all safe. This message sponsored by the Wisconsin Department of Transport.
Again, it's getting harder, right? It's getting harder and harder to distinguish this. This next sample, I think maybe you can tell because maybe it stops at a different point.
A recent study at Penn State University found that when you smile, you don't only appear to be more likable and courteous, but you actually appear to be more competent.
So the accent sometimes, when we're not used to an accent, we are much more forgiving of that accent in terms of its clarity, and we don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with it. But the pause in the middle was something that sort of gave away, maybe this is not, a human doing that. But in general, they are getting better. So one more sample.
Special advertised offers reflect specific vehicle stock numbers listed in the supporting information for each offer and are available for well-qualified consumers with approved credit. Special offers may require financing or leasing through a particular financial services vendor or for a...
Okay. So actually, disclaimers are really hard to do. And that voice was actually built from a fast talker who then we created a synthetic voice from him. It wasn't just speeding up the synthetic voice. It was actually created by starting with a fast talker to start. In these next few slides, what I'm going to do is the pluses are basically the opportunities or the things that are good, and the exclamation mark is really what I was using for the warning sign of well, what do we have to think about? So here, operational efficiency, personalized targeting, using AI alone plus in hybrid situations. This is what is possible with this new content generation. But we have to consider the rights of the voice talent as well as the royalty shares and so on and so forth. So this becomes complicated. It's not just about the technology. As it gets better, we have to think about what are you displacing? And there's a lot of fear amongst voice talent in terms of what's going to happen for their careers. I'm just going to skip this part and move on to, well, what can you do once the voice is built? So a lot of the control that's necessary for manipulating these, especially the modular speech synthesizers, there are user interfaces like this one. This just happens to be vocal IDs. There's so many others that are available now where you can manipulate the speed, the pitch, the loudness of the voice, and segments of it as well. And also do what we call SSML, right, to manipulate that. There's also tone changes as well as pronunciation changes. And this next slide shows you phonetically changing lexicons in order to make sure that the pronunciation comes out right. No synthesizer, no matter how much data you have, is going to get proper names right. Although I have to say, sometimes synthesizers get my name right more than humans do. So it really depends in terms of whether it's a phonetic name, spelled phonetically or not. So just ideas in terms of, I think there's a lot that can be done still in terms of how we control the synthesis, not just making the technology itself better, but how do you get into it once the model is built to manipulate it further? The next use case is gaming. So this next video is going to show you really where we want to, I think the holy grail for synthesis is emotion. So I'll play you the sample.
I can still hear voices. Sometimes, if I'm lucky, I hear her. And it's like she's right here with us. Her warmth, her love. I miss her. I just don't understand. What did I do? Faith. There's something you need to know. Mom, don't leave me. You can't just go. You need to find out for yourself.
You get the idea. I mean, this is a sample created by a company called SANE.
Waited long enough.
Okay, stop talking. Very powerful storytelling, all synthetic characters, the ability to modulate the speech and the prosody. You hear the creakiness in the voice, the cry. It's pretty remarkable, actually. But it does start to get into a place where there can be this weird uncanny valley as well. And also the whole, are we being deceived or not? I mean, and that really came up in this next use case where you've all seen movies where there's a line and, in it that was synthesized, and there's the uproar about whether that was ethical or not. And sometimes it maybe wasn't. And sometimes it potentially, there was all the rights were taken into account and so on and so forth. And here we're seeing text to speech as well as speech to speech technologies being used to generate these samples. The companies on the bottom that produce some of these are Respeecher, Semantic, and Resemble. So again, I think one of the big things is, and you also, I think Amazon just released a product about recreating the voice of an individual who's no longer with us. So again, we're starting to see that there's more acceptance as well. We have to think about, are you and I comfortable with listening to voices of people that are no longer here? So it's not just about, can we make it? It just because it's possible doesn't mean that it's wanted. And it also doesn't mean that we are ready for it. And so I think that's the other thing as scientists and as people working in industry, we have to think about the technology developing, but also making sure that that people are ready for it and are accepting it and understanding what it means, and that there are going to be protections as well for it. So the opportunities are huge to democratize who's heard. For the first time, we can make voices of people with accents, with people all over the world, with speaking different languages. This was not really possible when it cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions. And also there was less acceptance about voices that were different or didn't have the same clarity as standard English or standard in whatever language it is. It also gives us the capabilities of creating absolutely new media in real time or near real time, and totally new audiences. There's about 50% of the world that's not literate. And so text-based technologies don't reach them. So much of our information isn't actually heard by people who can't read, right? What speech synthesis does is allows that technology, that information now to reach ears that weren't being reached before. Those are completely new audiences, completely new applications. And also, I just wanted to put up in along with those opportunities, there's a lot of really fascinating work happening in crosslingual learning, where, let's say I don't speak Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. But if I've made a voice for myself, a speech synthesis voice for myself in English, we can graft my English voice to a Spanish voice by just having a little bit of data from a Spanish base model. And so some of this speaker encoding, language encoding, multi-speaker models are really, I think, where there's going to be a lot more work in the near future. Or there's already work now, and I think we're going to see more of that. Here's the challenges. The challenges have to do with the data sets. The data sets that are not clean, data sets that are not, they shouldn't be used. Data set shouldn't be used, meaning we don't have the rights to use them. Performances of the models themselves, latency. Some of the best models out there, we can produce incredible speech synthesis models, but they don't run on, anything outside of the FANG's supercomputers, right? They do not run on regular computers or even server farms that are for smaller companies that are not the big companies. They certainly will not run on someone's laptop or someone's cell phone. And so there is a lot of sort of changes that have to happen there. In terms of emotion, I think we still also have to think about that. And then the interoperability. So if we make a voice that is in one technology, will it run on a different device, and so on and so forth. And then the last really is the challenges are around regulation and business models. What is the regulation going to be of the use of these voices, and also what are the business models in terms of who shares in the revenue and the profits as well? Some of the unintended consequences are the potential for the technology to be misused, and I can kind of go into this if we have time for questions or not. So there's some work being done on proactive countermeasures to essentially make sure that if a voice is built, a synthetic voice that's more and more realistic sounding, how can we make sure that it isn't being abused or misused for things like voice biometrics and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of work also on by organizations like the Open Voice Network, the SAG-AFTRA, which is the Union for Voice Talent, as well as a smaller group called Athos, which is a combination of a number of us synthetic media companies, including Modulate. I think some of you are here, Vocal ID and other companies that are trying to create new ethical standards for voice creation so that the creators of synthetic voice are at the table when the regulations are going to be taking place as well. So the last thing I want to end on is some of the work that's being done by Microsoft and others in audio stagnography, which is essentially watermarking. So you want to make sure that the synthetic samples that you're creating have these inaudible watermarks on them, such that if the voice is used in a way that wasn't supposed to be used, we know what who the source of the voice is, and that it's a synthetic sample and not a real sample. This is great to embed this in the technology, and it's great for developers of the technology to embed these watermarks. But what you still need is the decoders and the standard to be adopted so that the decoding is happening on the end of the end users, and that we can understand. We don't need to just know, oh, Microsoft made this sample or Vocal ID made this sample. We need to know, were they allowed to make that sample? Should they have made that sample? Should they be playing the sample beyond this particular time? And so there's a lot more than just putting watermarks when we talk about the safety of these voices in the future. And I think that's where this group and this community can play a huge role. And I think it's also going to be working with communities like the blockchain community to be thinking about how do you use these watermarks and actually make sure that there's provenance in terms of who has ownership over these as well. So I'm going to end on what we call, we're calling the AI moonshot, which is essentially, and it's part of the Athos standard as well, which is that AI voices, our goal is to create these voices that are convincing without being deceptive, that connect us rather than divide us, that benefit us all, not just some, and that celebrate our diversity to make us all a little bit more human rather than less human. Right? Thank you.
When you spoke about the source and filter model, could you talk a little bit more about the technical aspect of that separation? You said that some features of the voice are preserved in the source rather than in the filter. Which aspects do you think are mostly captured in your text in the source? Is it like performance or something else, or the pitch contours?
Yeah. So there's actually a number of features. Thanks for that question around. There's a number of features in the source. We don't really want the form and characteristics because the form and characteristics are going to be relatively distorted here. So in this is a very special use case where, it's like taking the egg white and yolk from a brown egg and a white egg and sort of mixing them separately, right? When you separate egg white and yolk, you're still going to get one and the other, right? So the idea is to get as much of the intonation, so the pitch, voice quality, things such as the pattern of change of their voice. You'll see spectral tilt in there. You'll see a number of different features, about 40, 50 features in the acoustics in that we're going to be getting when we inverse filter the source. With the filter, you'll still, or the surrogate speakers, all their recordings, you're still going to get a little bit of the source, and we want to separate that out. We don't want to use the source of the donor. Otherwise, the resulting voice is basically going to sound like the donor. So the idea is to how to not distort the signal without also giving away the identity of the donor voice. So it's a combination of both of those together. Does that help?
I have a question about this. I have to share the for the training model. Is that a new report?
Yes.
Is that a time value control of motions within our objects?
So I don't know exactly what they did because it's not, it's Semantic. It's a different company that produced that sample. I believe there's modulation after the synthesis has been completed to do like so there's DSP sort of post synthesis. I believe that's what it is. I don't think the features are modulated specifically like that's crying or whatever. And there's also different data sets in terms of the style of speech that's recorded to create the voice.